There's something a little unbelievable about growing a serious amount of food in something as simple and rough as a cement bag, and that's exactly what made me want to try this experiment in the first place. Because most people think potatoes need a big garden bed, deep soil, and a lot of space. But what if I told you that you could grow up to 100 potatoes in a single reused cement bag right on your balcony, rooftop, or even a small backyard corner? And not only that, but do it in just 60 days with surprisingly powerful results. And that's exactly what we're testing today. So make sure you watch this video till the end, because I'll share a special tip that can completely change your results. So the idea started with one simple question. Can we push a small space container to produce a high yield without expensive equipment? And instead of using traditional grow bags or pots, I decided to use something most people throw away, an empty cement bag, which is surprisingly durable, breathable, and perfect for this kind of experiment if you prepare it correctly. And that's where things get interesting. I took a standard used cement bag, shook out all the leftover dust, and then rinsed it thoroughly, because any remaining cement residue can harm plant roots. And after letting it dry completely, I reinforced the bottom slightly by folding it twice so it could hold the weight of wet soil. Because once you water it, the bag gets heavy, and you don't want it tearing halfway through the process. Then I poked several drainage holes at the bottom and along the lower sides using a screwdriver. And this is extremely important because potatoes hate sitting in soggy soil. And if water doesn't drain properly, your entire crop can rot before it even begins to form. Now comes the soil mix, and this is where a lot of people go wrong, because regular garden soil alone is too compact, and potatoes need loose, airy soil to expand and grow properly. So I created a mix using 40% garden soil, 30% compost, and 30% coco peat, and then I added a handful of wood ash and a bit of sand to improve drainage and potassium levels, which potatoes absolutely love. And when you mix all of this together, you get a light, fluffy growing medium that holds moisture but doesn't suffocate the roots. After preparing the mix, I filled the cement bag about 1/3 full, not all the way, because potatoes grow best when you gradually add soil as the plant grows. And this technique is called hilling, and it's one of the secrets to increasing your yield significantly. Now for the star of the experiment, the seed potatoes. I selected medium-sized potatoes with visible eyes, and instead of planting them whole, I cut them into chunks, making sure each piece had at least 1 or 2 eyes. And then I left them out for about a day so the cut surfaces could dry and form a protective layer, which helps prevent rotting once they're planted. Then I placed about 6 to 8 pieces evenly spaced on top of the soil inside the bag, making sure they weren't too close to each other because overcrowding reduces yield. And then I gently covered them with about 3 to 4 inches of the same soil mix. At this stage, it looks simple, almost too simple, but what happens next is where the real magic begins. I watered the bag lightly, just enough to moisten the soil without soaking it, and then placed it in a spot where it gets at least 6 to 7 hours of sunlight daily, because potatoes need good sunlight to develop strong foliage, which directly affects how many tubers they produce underground. Now the waiting game begins, but not the boring kind, because within just 7 to 10 days, I started seeing tiny green shoots pushing through the soil. And this is always one of the most satisfying moments, because it means your setup is working and your potatoes are alive and growing. As the shoots grew taller, reaching about 6 to 8 inches, I added more soil into the back, covering about half of the stems, leaving only the top leaves exposed. And this stop is extremely important, because every time you cover the stem, it encourages the plant to grow more tubers along that buried section. And this is how we aim to increase the total number of potatoes in such a small container. Over the next couple of weeks, I repeated this process 2 more times, each time adding more soil as the plant grew taller, until the bag was almost full. And by this point, the plants looked lush, green, and surprisingly healthy, with thick stems and vibrant leaves, which is exactly what you want to see. Around the 3rd week, I introduced a simple feeding routine using a liquid compost tea once every 7 days. And this gave the plants an extra boost of nutrients, especially nitrogen and potassium, which are crucial during the early and middle growth stages. And I could actually see the difference within days as the leaves became deeper green and the growth rate noticeably increased. Now here's something a lot of beginners miss: watering consistency. Potatoes don't like extremes. They don't want to be bone dry, and they definitely don't want to be waterlogged. So I kept the soil consistently moist by watering every 2 to 3 days, depending on the weather. And I always check the top inch of soil before watering, because overwatering is one of the fastest ways to ruin your crop. Around day 30, something interesting started happening. The plants reached their full height, and some even began to flower. And while flowering isn't always guaranteed, it's often a sign that tuber formation is happening underground, which means your potatoes are actively developing. And this is where patience becomes your best tool. Now at this stage, you might be tempted to dig around and check the potatoes, but resist that urge, because disturbing the roots can reduce your final yield significantly. And instead, focus on maintaining healthy foliage and consistent care. One powerful tip I discovered during this phase is to rotate the bag slightly every few days, so all sides get equal sunlight. And this helps prevent uneven growth, especially if your growing space has directional light. And it's a small trick, but it can make a noticeable difference in overall plant health. Another important detail is airflow. Since we're using a cement bag, it naturally allows some breathability, but placing it too close to walls or in a cramped corner can reduce airflow and increase the risk of fungal issues. So keeping it in an open, airy spot really helps. As the days progress toward the 45-day mark, I notice the lower leaves starting to yellow slightly, and this is completely normal because it signals that the plant is shifting energy from foliage growth to tuber development. And at this point, I reduced nitrogen feeding and focused more on potassium-rich inputs like diluted banana peel solution, which supports better potato formation. The plant still looked strong overall, but you could feel that something was changing beneath the soil, something you couldn't see yet. And that's what makes this kind of experiment so exciting, because you're building toward a result that stays hidden until the very end. And the real question now becomes, how many potatoes are actually growing inside that one simple cement bag? And are we anywhere close to that goal of 100? By the time we crossed the 50-day mark, the transformation in the plants became much more noticeable. The once vibrant green leaves slowly started to fade, turning pale yellow and even slightly dry at the edges. And this is actually one of the most important signals you can observe, because it tells you that the plant is reaching the final stage of its life cycle, where all the energy has been redirected underground into forming and maturing the potatoes. And at this point, many beginners make a critical mistake by either overwatering or trying to revive the plant with more fertilizer. But the truth is, this is exactly what you want to see. And instead of interfering, you need to step back slightly and let the plant complete its natural process. I gradually reduced watering during this phase, allowing the soil to dry a bit more between each watering cycle, and this helps toughen the potato skins and improves their storage quality after harvest, which is a small but powerful adjustment that can make a big difference in the final result. Around day 55, most of the foliage had turned yellow and started collapsing, and the bag itself felt heavier than before, which was a very exciting sign, because it meant the tubers inside had developed significantly. And even though I couldn't
see them yet, I could almost imagine them filling up the entire space inside the bag. Now here comes the moment that makes this entire experiment worth it, the harvest. And instead of pulling the plants out from the top, which can damage the potatoes, I carefully laid the cement bag on its side and slowly cut it open using a knife. And what happened next honestly surprised me more than I expected. As the soil spilled out, the first few potatoes rolled out, clean, firm, and beautifully shaped. And as I gently broke apart the soil, more and more potatoes started appearing. Some small, some medium, and quite a few larger ones as well. And it quickly became clear that this simple cement bag had turned into a dense pocket of food production. I kept collecting them one by one, counting as I went, and the numbers kept climbing. 20, 40, 60, and by the time I finished, the total was incredibly satisfying. Not just because of the number itself, but because of what it represented, the success of a simple, low-cost experiment that almost anyone can replicate. Now, reaching exactly 100 potatoes can depend on several factors like the variety you use, the care you provide, and even the climate. But what truly matters here is the concept, because even if you get slightly less, say 70 or 80 potatoes, that's still an impressive yield for such a small container. And the efficiency of this method is what makes it so powerful for survival gardening and small space growers. One thing I noticed during harvesting is that the potatoes formed in layers, almost like hidden compartments throughout the bag, which confirms how effective the hilling technique was. Because each time we added soil, the plant responded by producing more tubers along the buried stems. And without that step, the yield would have been significantly lower. Another interesting observation was the soil condition after harvest. It remained loose and rich, meaning it can be reused with minor amendments, which adds another layer of sustainability to this method, because you're not constantly needing fresh soil for every cycle. Now, let me share a couple of pro-level insights that can push your results even further if you try this yourself. The first one is pre-sprouting your seed potatoes before planting, also known as chitting, where you let the potatoes sit in a bright spot until they develop short, strong sprouts. And this can speed up growth and give your plants a stronger start, especially in shorter growing seasons. The second tip is to use a slightly wider bag if possible, because while depth helps with layering, width allows more tubers to form without overcrowding. And finding the right balance between depth and width can maximize your yield even more. And here's another small but powerful trick. Adding a thin layer of mulch on top of the soil once the bag is full can help retain moisture and regulate temperature, which keeps the plant stress-free during hotter days. Now, as promised in the beginning, here's that special tip that can completely change your results, and it's something most people overlook. Instead of planting all your seed potatoes at once, stagger them in 2 layers with a slight delay, meaning you plant half at the base and the other half about 10 days later when you do your first hilling. And what this does is extend the production window inside the same container, leading to more efficient use of space and potentially higher total yield, because the plants won't all compete at the exact same stage of growth. This one adjustment alone can noticeably increase how many potatoes you harvest from a single bag. Looking at the final pile of potatoes from this experiment, it's hard not to feel a sense of satisfaction, not just because of the quantity, but because of how accessible this method is. You don't need a large farm, expensive tools, or even perfect conditions, just a bit of creativity, consistency, and willingness to experiment. This is exactly what survival gardening is about, making the most out of limited resources and turning everyday items into productive systems that can support your food needs. And the best part is, once you understand the process, you can repeat it again and again, improving each time, trying different varieties, tweaking your soil mix, adjusting your watering, and gradually mastering the technique until you consistently get high yields. So if you've ever thought that growing your own potatoes requires a big garden, this experiment proves otherwise. And maybe the next